All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hot Glass Show. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We've got a really special demonstration for you this evening. We've got a guest artist with us, Rob Stern. Let's welcome Rob to the stage. Well, we've got quite a few people up here on the stage, so I'm just going to introduce everybody all at once. Sitting down at the bench is going to be George Kennard. He'll be kind of helping turn a really large piece of glass today. So George is going to be sticking by Rob's side this whole time. Yeah, all right. We've got students in this class. Rob's actually teaching a class here at the studio. It's just across the parking lot. Some of you may have gone over there to do a make-your-own experience today. Well, Rob's been teaching there all week, so 4 of his students are here today. That's Zach right behind George, Brad, and Rebecca, and Josh here. This here is Chris Giordano. He's a local. He's been working here with us, and he just decided he's going to come and help out as well. My name is Dane, and I'm going to talk you all through this process. If anybody has questions, send them on up to me. I'm always happy to answer them for you. We're here to help educate all of you, and we want to know what you're interested in learning about. But I was just talking to Rob a little while ago, asking him about what he'd like to make this evening. And Rob said he'd like to make a piece that he's done something very similar before, and it's a piece with a bunch of different leaves that are all connected together to kind of create a vessel of sorts. So Rob was just telling me before the show started that this is a piece he's done before for, they call them centerpieces at a place called Pilchuck School, and it's a big fundraiser that they do every single year. Well, Rob was a designer years back, and this is a piece that he came up with to make as their centerpieces. So I've seen a few just photos of them, and they're really beautiful. But we've got the whole team working together here. This is going to take a lot of effort from everybody to make this all happen. But basically, we've got this first little leaf that's on the end of the iron. And this is the base of the piece that we're making. So we're going to continue to build off from this. Chris, right now, he's just starting up a leaf. Now, this is all solid, and if anybody's been to one of our shows prior, maybe earlier on in the day, you've probably seen us start every piece with a bubble off the end of the iron. That's not going to be the same way with this piece. So instead, we're just using solid irons, we're collecting glass, adding color, and adding a bit of texture as well. So I think that this is a homemade tool that Rob brought with him. I can see it's just welded together, but this is a stamp. So he lets the glass, or I guess Chris right now is letting the glass drip onto this table, and then just pressing down with this tool, he's able to create that leaf-like pattern on the glass. Yeah. Sure, you got it. So Rob, what colors are we using today? Okay, so we've got a purple that kind of fades to an apricot color. What's that? Cool. You said you already got it? George just asked me to add a little bit of wax to our roller bearings here. Because these roller bearings are so close to the hot reheating furnace, they tend to seize up. So we need to keep lubricating them just to make sure that they're going to turn nice and smooth. Does that work good for you, George? Great. So is anybody new to glass? Is there anybody that has not seen a glass blowing demonstration yet? No? All right. Well, for those of you that might be joining in online, this is a live streamed event, so we've got people all over the world watching this evening. A little bit about the glass that we're working with. We're working with a type of glass called soda lime glass. It's the most common type in the world, and I bet you all of us come in contact with it every single day. Glass is made out of sand. Everybody's heard that, right? but we're not using beach sand. It's just not pure enough. So we use something mined out of the ground. It's called silica, silicon dioxide. And we have to add a few things to it just because pure silica has a really high melting temperature. So we'll add a flux, which is soda ash, lowers the melting temperature. It's really important too because it keeps the glass soft and workable for a longer period of time. And then the final thing that we add is a stabilizer for the material, which is limestone. Now, we melt only clear glass inside our furnace. In fact, right in the center of our stage, we have a furnace that holds, I bet you, 1,000 pounds of glass when it's full. And we collect it out of this one door. It's the same door we add the glass to as it begins to kind of fine out or as we lose glass from it throughout the day. So it's all clear, but we are using color. And over here on the far side of our stage, we've got a little booth set up with our color in it. Now, color is made simply by adding heavy metal oxides to the glass in the melting process. And there are many different forms of color that we can get. And each form of color has a different look to it. Sometimes we'll use something that we call color bar, which comes to us in bar form. And we just cut off a section of it. This gives us a very uniform pattern. All of these pieces right here are made with color bars, so that leaves us with this really uniform kind of pattern. But from the day-to-day pieces that we make up here, we tend to use a crushed up form of that bar that we call frit. Frit has a much more kind of speckled pattern. We don't have any really great examples of this speckled pattern up here. You might be able to see the kind of speckles in the bottom of this bowl here. So that was made with frit. Now, Rob's decided that he'd like to make this piece using what we call powder. It's just refined even more. So it's a very fine powder, and it gives you a nice even coating, but it also allows you to create a kind of a gradient of color throughout the piece. One of the things about working with powder, though, is it's really easy to get airborne, and that's not very safe for us. So we have a booth over there that has an exhaust vent, and it basically just keeps all of the powder from coming out into our studio, so it keeps us safe. So if you look at what Rob's doing right now, he's added the color on. He's encased that color with more clear glass. He shaped it into a very specific shape, and then using that tool, once again, he's able to create that texture. So Rob, I'm just curious, how many of these leaves do you think you've made in your career? He says too many. But that's what makes Rob so good at doing this. You know, glass blowing isn't something that you can pick up in a day or a week or a year. It's something that you have to really kind of do continuously. Consistency is very important in learning this material. And while it may seem a bit monotonous doing the same thing over and over again, it's necessary for anybody to become a skilled glass worker. So we're going to begin to attach different components together. And something that's really important when we're doing this is having the temperatures just right. So you can see Rob's got the glass so hot right now that he's not even turning the iron. It's just too hot to turn. So the reason this is so important is because if we make a connection that's rather cold, we call it a cold seal connection, it's weak, and eventually it'll break. We're looking for what we call a hot seal connection, and that's when the glass is hot enough that it's fusing together. So that's a very strong connection. All right, so we've got the first leaf on there. And this is almost like a production style setup where he's got his whole team working on different stages in the process. So you can see Josh has gathered up some glass. He's shaping it on the table. Chris over here is in the next step of the process, adding the color. I think he's even gathered some clear glass over it. And I imagine they're just going to continue to pass off like this, almost like an assembly line, if you will. So how are we doing on the online viewers, Amanda? All right, we've got about 100 people watching right now. Excellent. Thanks for watching us, everybody. Well, if you have questions online, please feel free to send them in. We've got Amanda Sterling here. She's one of our social media experts, and she'll be relaying the messages to us. So Rob is a visiting artist. He comes to us from Miami, Florida. So he's a resident of Miami. But he's got a long history of glassworking. He actually graduated his undergrad in San Francisco. And then, Rob, you did your graduate program at University of Miami? All right. Yeah, people ask us constantly when they come to the museum, how do you learn to do something like this? Because it seems like such an obscure job. But I think that most people this day and age, they go to college for it. And it is very popular in art school. Usually, colleges that have a sculpture program might have glass blowing in that program. I think there's probably about 45 different universities in the States right now that teach glass blowing. Really see Rob's working that glass extremely hot. And that's also very important to become a good glass worker. You have to learn how to work the glass hot, but also know when not to work the glass too hot. They call it glass blowing, but it's really such a small part of the process. I think it's a bit more accurate to call us temperature managers. All right. So Rob's ready to add the next leaf onto this piece. And we're just going to continue to build off from this. The website for live streaming? If you just go to the cmog.org website, there should be a link probably on the main page. Is that right, Amanda?
Yes.
We've got it on the main. Okay, the home page of our website. So Zach's using a hot torch right there. It's a really intense flame. It's probably about 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And he's using that flame just to kind of spot heat very specific areas. And that, again, is just to make sure that those connections are really, really hot. This way, they're very, very strong. So I was talking with Rob before the show started, and I kind of asked him about this piece and when the first time he made it was. And he told me that he, although lives in Florida now, he was living in, I think, Arlington, Texas for a while. And this is one of the first times he's had to deal with fall. And one of the things about being in a place that has fall weather is all of the falling leaves. And he said he ended up raking leaves for much longer than he wanted to. So he decided to create this piece as a little bit of therapy to help him work through all of that. What color is this? I believe Rob said that it's a purple with, I think it's going to fade from a purple to kind of an apricot color. Yeah. You know, one of the hard things about viewing the color when you're making it is that when glass is hot, it never shows its true color. So we won't actually know what this looks like until probably tomorrow. And we might even let it cool down for longer than that. You know, all glass has to cool down slowly. If glass is cooled too quickly, it'll break apart from thermal shock. Just to explain that in more detail, when glass cools, it shrinks a very small amount. And if cooled too quickly, the surface, it begins to shrink or contract at a faster rate than the inside or core of the glass. So that's what causes the glass to break apart. Now, everything that is made out of glass has to go through a slow cooling process called annealing. This piece here, we might cool it down for 36 hours. I believe the larger, the thicker the piece is, the longer you have to cool it down. And for this piece, it's better to cool it down for longer than not long enough. So you can never over anneal anything, but you can definitely under anneal things. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Rob, one of the questions online is who are you inspired by? Okay. So you say a lot of different artists that you've worked with, not necessarily glass. It could be musicians, painters. Okay. So you're inspired by nature. All right. Right, so the question is manganese making this color purple? And manganese is typical of a purple type of glass. Manganese oxide, rather, is used to make purple glass. There's a lot of different things that go into glass chemistry, and I've got to be honest, I don't know a whole lot about all of the glass chemistry. In fact, here at the museum, we buy just about all of our color from a few different companies. But within those companies, I imagine there's maybe 250 different choices for us. All right. So we're getting ready for this next leaf here. And you can really see how everybody on the stage is moving. That's, I think, really impressive. A lot of the time when we have an artist come here, there's one thing going on. There's one thing happening at the bench, and they're making something. And they're in control of the whole process. But Rob here, he's got so many different people doing different things, and it really allows him to control the team loosely, but to make something of a very large scale and to do it quickly as well. You can almost see the vessel taking shape. It's like a coil pot almost, except made out of leaves. So we're building from the ground up. Okay, so the question is, do we get more of a color from the powdered frit or from something that's a little more coarse, like what we normally use? So just to talk about frit for a moment, there's many different consistencies of frit, and it kind of goes in a number from a powder to a 0, and then it goes up to 5. So 5 being the coarsest, and powder, of course, being the finest. I don't know if you would get more color per se. I think a lot of people really enjoy using the powder instead of frit, mainly because of the consistency, the ability to fade colors. And also, if you don't add a layer of clear over it, it creates a really beautiful kind of sheen to the glass that's not quite as common in using frit. George, how's the piece feeling? All right. Yeah, absolutely. I'll grab it. So the studio that we're in right now, our Amphitheater Hot Shop, we just started this program in here in 2015. So this shop's a few years old. But before making it, we spent years of research and development going around to many different studios around the world. And we were just asking all of these different artists, all these different studios, what do they like about their equipment, about their stage or their studio that they work in? And then what would you change? What would you do differently? What do you wish you had? Now, I think it goes without saying that while we're up here, we're standing next to a 2,000-degree furnace. It's pretty hot all the time. But I've got to say that this is probably the coolest environment that I've ever blown glass in. And it's because we've got air-conditioned vents up here. So all these this whole track here, they're all vents that pop up and blow cold air across the stage. So it's really nice for us, but glass doesn't always like to be cooled down. Again, if it cools too fast, it's going to break apart. And rushing air across the stage, that's really what's going to cool it down the quickest. So George asked me to close up one of these vents just so we don't have to worry about it cooling the glass down too much. Any questions from the audience? I think it's really interesting. I'll come on out to answer your question. I think it's really interesting all of the different tools that you'll find in a glass studio. You can shape glass with anything that's not going to melt, so we don't use plastic tools up here, but if it's metal, you can use it to shape the glass, to put impressions on the glass. And a lot of artists that are making their own work, they tend to find their own tools, they make their own tools. I know a lot of glass sculptors that they have a special butter knife that they use for sculpting, and they'll swear by it. Yeah. How do they get the leaves to stick together? Great question. It's all about the temperature of the material. So when we're applying these leaves, you can see that Rob, he goes in for a really long heat in the furnace. And the glass is so hot that he can't even turn that leaf. It just starts to drip off from the end of the iron. So it's because the glass is so hot then that it adheres or it attaches. And if Rob came over with the glass a little bit too cold, he could touch it against the other piece of glass and it wouldn't even stick. So we have to have all the glass hot. Yeah. Sure, yeah. So Rob went to art school in San Francisco, and he got a degree in glassmaking there. Now, I'm not sure if that was Rob's first intention to learn to make glass. Let me ask him. Okay. So I'll ask him in just a second here. Yeah, so I don't know about Rob specifically, but I have a lot of friends that went to school and they wanted to be artists. So a lot of people went to ceramics for their first year and then discovered glass while they were going to school for ceramics. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you could be introduced to this material. Traditionally, it was something that might be a family thing. So maybe you're a family of glassworkers that goes back for generations, and you're kind of born into this lifestyle where you're making glass for either a company or you've got your own family company. I have friends that are blowing glass, and their parents were glass artists before them. Hey, Rob. Hey, Rob. Question for you. So, did you know that you wanted to be a glass artist when you went to college, or did you find glass in college? You found it. Okay. Yeah. I love it. Yeah. So Rob said that he found glass in college. He knew he wanted to be an artist, but his background was working in a lot of different mediums. But in high school and before college, he did a lot of performance art, and he kind of said that this really called to him because if you watch this whole demonstration, it really is a performance. And I like to kind of talk about the team in the choreography of everything happening together and kind of working in unison to create one final project or one piece? That's a great question. So we've got this larger reheating furnace that we're using today, and this is something that we don't put on every single day. But you're going to see George, he's got a pretty tough job of just carrying this thing back and forth to the furnace. Again, we have to keep all of the glass warm. Even that glass that's on the end of the iron, it's not part of the piece, but if that cools down too much, there's a good chance this piece will just fall right on the floor. And that's why it's so important to use torches. This allows us to spot heat very specific areas. When you think about heating glass inside this furnace, it's like a big barrel of heat. And the heat's always coming out of the door. So the further you are inside the furnace, the hotter it's going to be. Now, the problem is that the iron is always the last part that goes inside the furnace and the first that comes out. So we really have to try to kind of maintain a temperature back there. Using a torch allows us not to have to overheat the top part. So that allows us to keep the form that we've worked hard to create. Hello. Absolutely, yeah. So for all of you listening out there, the question is it possible to heat the glass so much that the pattern they've created and pressed into it disappears? And it is, it really is. Glass naturally, when you heat it, it just wants to condense. It wants to ball up and lose all of that definition. So I think once the piece, once the petal or the leaf is on the piece, we're typically not going to get that so hot that it would lose definition. The really hard part is once you've pressed the glass with that tool to create the pattern, you have to keep the core temperature in it, because once that cools down, that's when you kind of start getting into the situation where you have to heat it up so much again to reheat the core so that it's malleable and workable, that you'll lose that surface texture. You're welcome. So Rob's got a specialized little paddle there that he's using. And that paddle is just made up of cork. Cork is a really great tool for us. Doesn't cool the glass down as much as, say, using a piece of metal to shape the glass. I think it's got a really great smell when it burns too. It's pretty common as a glass blower. Every time you go home after a day of work, you kind of smell like a campfire. It's just given at this point. So we do work with some combustible things up here, that cork paddle being one of them. We do use some wooden tools up here, and the wooden tools we use are typically made out of fruit woods. The reason for that is that fruit wood has a pretty dense grain pattern. It's a slow-growing tree, so it grows with a very dense grain pattern. Because of that, it burns away pretty evenly as well. Cherry wood is what we use up here, really just because it's abundant around this area. What do we use to heat the ovens? This shop is run on natural gas. So there are a few different ways to heat a shop. So this whole shop is run on natural gas. You can use propane. Some people are using methane. There's a lot of places that are capping landfills and then using the methane created from that to run a studio. But I've heard the problem is that it just doesn't create enough methane at a time to maintain a pressure, a constant pressure to run anything this big. So you might be able to run a small furnace and maybe one or two reheating chambers. We also, here at the museum, use electricity to power our whole studio. Not down here, but we have another stage. It's our innovation stage, and this is run completely on electricity. Just a few years ago, we received a patent for the first full electric hot shop. And this all came about because we needed to find a way to blow glass on cruise ships. Back in 2006 or 7, I believe, Celebrity Cruise Lines contacted the museum and they asked if we could do demonstrations, much like we do here on one of their cruise line ships. So it took us a year or two of research and development to figure that out. Normally we said, okay, yeah, we'd love to do that. And they said, oh yeah, well, you can't use gas. You can't have any combustibles on a ship because it's a huge hazard. So we worked with a great equipment builder. His name is Fred Metz, and his company is Spiral Arts. They're based in Washington State. And throughout a few years of research and development, we created this way to power the whole shop with electricity. It has its ups and downs. A gas-fired furnace, it tends to heat very intensely, which is great for making large-scale works because an electric furnace, it doesn't maintain temperature, and if you start to open up all the doors of the reheating chamber, it really cools down too much to use. But the one great thing about working with an electric reheating furnace is that it doesn't melt out all of that small little texture. So I like using it for small-scale sculpture and goblet making. Great question. I see it every day, so I forget to talk about this. One of the questions is, how do we have a camera inside our reheating furnace? Well, we don't have one inside there, but instead, we have a camera that sits behind the furnace, and there's a little window of a very special type of glass that the camera's looking through. Now, that type of glass that the window is made of, it's called fused silica. It was invented right here in Corning back in 1937, and it has an extremely high melting temperature. It's somewhere around maybe 3,800 degrees Fahrenheit.
Two big cork paddles over there.
I don't know. Hey, George, how heavy do you think that piece is right now? 20 pounds right now? That may or may not sound like a lot of weight. You can imagine maybe carrying a sack of grain that's 20 pounds. It probably doesn't feel all that heavy, but if you put that sack of grain on the end of a pole and you're not holding right at the head of the pole, it feels a lot heavier. So, I'm sorry? Right, yeah. So are they burning themselves on these irons? All of the rods that we use, they're made out of stainless steel. So stainless is a rather poor conductor of heat. Now, we do have to preheat the irons, though, in order for the glass to stick to them. So the first 6 inches or so of each of those irons, it's mostly solid. Because it's thicker, it has more thermal mass, it maintains that temperature for longer. The rest of it, it's all very thin-walled tubing, so it cools down pretty quickly. But if we're going to be making a piece of glass, and let's say we're spending 3 hours on a piece, there's just no way to keep that iron from heating up to where our hands are. So we have a special piece of equipment. It's right over here next to Amanda. It's a little box with a trough on the top of it. And we can set the iron in that trough. It fills up with water, and it helps to cool that iron for us. Yeah, you can see all of the irons. They have a kind of a tarnished, maybe 18 inches right from the head of it. We always call that the hospital zone, just because if you touch that area, you're probably going to the hospital. People ask us all the time if we burn ourselves. And I will say that, we're around a very hot material, so it happens from time to time, but you learn really quickly what not to do. I was talking with Rob before the show started too, and I said, do you have a very specific number of these leaves that you're going to add on to it? And he told me that he'll know when it's finished just by the shape that he's creating. And sometimes you just have to kind of let the glass kind of come together, and eventually you'll kind of see when it looks just perfect, and that's when it's time to stop. So we've got Brad over there. He's opening up the doors right now. And this is a job that I think is one of the most important jobs, and it's very much underlooked because it's a really tough job standing right next to that furnace for the whole time. But we, of course, need somebody there to open up the doors. So let's give it up for Brad today. Yeah, when you're working on something of this scale, every single job is really, really important. You can see that glass, it is so hot right now that they kind of have to work together. George is controlling the piece, but of course Rob's adding on these very hot bits of glass. And they have to do this kind of flipping back and forth just because that glass, it is falling. And Rob only wants it to touch down in very specific areas. So he has to have a really clear line of communication with George. And I'm not sure that George and Rob have ever worked with each other before. Glassmaking, it is really a kind of a universal language, if you will. You know, anybody that knows how to blow glass could meet somebody, even from a different country, if they didn't speak the same language. They would learn pretty quickly just to take cues from each other as to what the next step in the process is. All right. Doing a great job at keeping all of that glass on center. In theory, it's really easy to fix something once it falls off center. All you have to do is turn to the high side and let the glass fall back onto center and then continue to turn. So in theory, that sounds really easy, but when you're working with glass that's really hot, you've got different areas moving at different rates depending on the temperature, it becomes a lot harder in practice. Yeah.
Is it possible to overheat the glass? And how do the torches not leave soot marks?
So 2 questions from online. Is it possible to overheat the glass? Yes, it is. You know, George's job right now is to keep the glass warm. And he doesn't want to heat it so much that it starts to move. So that really is a lot of George's kind of job right now. You know, so you'll see he takes really kind of short but frequent reheats. And by doing that, we're able to maintain a steady temperature, more or less, and not get the glass to move a whole lot. So if George were to stay inside this reheating furnace for, you know, maybe an extra 20 seconds, that glass could start to move around. Now, Rob's a really great glass blower, and if he saw the glass starting to move a bit, he could fix it as long as he caught it in time. However, you know, if we went it too far, if we got the glass too hot, sometimes there's really no going back. And then the other question? Right, so how do the torches not leave soot marks? I believe that the soot on the glass is typically made just from having a flame that has a lot of gas, so it's very gas rich. It's all about having the proper balance between gas and oxygen with these torches. Even the soot that is put on the glass from time to time, if you reheat it, it burns off, and also you can wipe it off typically after the glass has cooled down. We got a really good view right now of adding the color on. And we've got color that's being applied to 2 different sides of the piece right now. So Rob, when you're having these leaves flattened, is one color on one side, one on the other, or is it twisted? Or?
So I do all different forms.
Okay.
It's all, like this, and we'll do the color fade from top to bottom. But somewhere in the middle, we generally transition from one color to another.
Okay.
And the thing kind of fades from color.
Okay, so we're kind of fading from one color on the bottom up to the top.
Mark on the side that tells us where the purple is, so that I can connect the purple to what's existing.
Great,
It's
great.
transitioning to red, and then we'll start with red.
Okay, thank you. So Rob was just saying that they're using a small little mark on the glass that's still on the iron, so that glass isn't going to ever be in the piece. But that mark tells him which color is which, and this allows him to kind of, as he's applying the glass onto the piece, to match up colors together. So we can continue to have that fade be very kind of fluid throughout the piece. I think one of the really nice things about working with powder as opposed to bar or frit is even if you're using an opaque powder, sometimes you can apply it light enough that it creates this kind of translucent color, and it allows you to kind of play with the density of the color a bit to create a number of different shades. More questions from online? All right.
Make a watercolor effect by dusting different colors in different spots of the glass.
Can you make a watercolor effect by dusting different colors into different spots on the glass? Yeah, I suppose you could. You know, something to think about, at least as you're applying color in the beginning of the process, is that every bit of color that you add on there, it's going to move or distort in some way, especially if you're making a blown piece, because that piece is going to stretch quite a bit. I know some people like to make the whole piece out of clear, and then it's not until the very end that they add color. So that could be a possible way to do it. However, of course, you're limited as to how hot you can get the piece again. So oftentimes, you're not able to melt the color in completely, and it leaves surface texture, which is sometimes desirable. So here you go. You can hear Rob. He's kind of talking to George about the movement of the iron, working together. They cut that free. Really quickly, you can get right inside there and push that leaf back to the shape that it needs to be. So I hear Rob, he's kind of giving instructions to the team. And it sounds like after this transitional color, we're going to start going more towards the red spectrum of this, as far as the leaves go. We've got a really great animation that we can play. If you look up to our screens, it will show you an animation of gathering from our furnace. That's a common question that we get. You know, what does it look like inside there? So inside our furnace, we have what we call a crucible. It's like a big hemispheric pot. It's made out of a high-fired ceramic material, and it holds a vat of glass. It's very similar to the consistency of honey at 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. So when we're collecting glass, we have to dip the iron, or sometimes the gather glass we already have on the iron, below the level inside our furnace. But it's really the constant rotation of that iron. That's what's allowing us to collect all that material and also to keep all that material on center. There really is an art to learning how to gather glass consistently. To make each one of these leaves a consistent size and shape, it's important to have kind of the same person doing the same thing over and over again. And that's why an assembly line is kind of preferable for this situation. You know, one person's in charge of gathering the glass, and they've got that dialed in, so they can do it the same every time. And maybe another person is in charge of adding the color, which allows them to make sure the color is consistent throughout the piece. Another person's working on shaping and pressing the leaf pattern into the glass. Can everybody see right now how there's a little bit of movement? You know, George stops turning for a second, but the whole piece seems to be kind of falling very slowly towards the ground. That little bit of movement is something that we're actually looking for, because if the glass isn't moving at all, it means that it's starting to get to that point where it could be too cold, it could break apart on its own. So having a little bit of movement is safe for us. Yeah. People ask us quite often about wearing protective gear. All of us that are on stage, we all have to wear protective eyewear, so that's a must. It's our policy here at the museum always to wear closed-toed shoes as well. You'll see some other protective gear around the shop right now. Like Rob right now, he's wearing a glove on his hand. Now, if he was turning the iron, he wouldn't be wearing the glove because it would compromise his ability to turn consistently. But because he's got his hand so close to the glass for prolonged periods of time, it's almost necessary. On that arm, he also has a special sleeve, and that sleeve is a kind of a Kevlar sleeve. It helps to protect his arm from the radiant heat. One of the most common ways for us to burn ourselves, it really is just from the heat coming off from the glass. You know, we can feel the temperature coming off from the glass, so we know from, you know, being a foot or two away that the glass is near us. But it's just part of the process. Sometimes we have to be close to the glass to shape it. So having that sleeve allows us to stay there for a longer period of time to do our shaping. So we do have two different types of torches here. The one with the red handle there, that's a really hot, very intense flame, and that it's mostly just used for spot heating very specific areas that maybe we're trying to adhere another leaf to. The other one's a really bushy flame, and that one is mainly just used to maintain a temperature inside the back of the piece, at least for this demonstration. So Chris here is working on shaping the leaf. Now, Chris, did you say you've worked with Rob prior? You've worked with Rob before? Okay, great. This is for the centerpieces then. Okay. Earlier I touched base on Rob doing a piece very similar to this for the centerpieces used in a glass school called Penland. They have an auction to raise money for their programs. And Chris, he was actually there helping Rob out. So it's always nice to have somebody that's seen the whole process before. Earlier I did say that the color, it's not really going to show itself until at least the next day or two once it's fully cooled down. So if you're really curious, we're always going to take the live stream videos after the piece has been made. We'll photograph it. We'll put it on our social media outlets. What are we currently using for social media? We use Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, and Tumblr. Okay, so those 4 different accounts will probably be posting different images of this on each of those, I imagine. It's really often that I'm asked, what's the hardest piece to make? And I think that that's a really hard question to answer. So the easiest answer I have is the piece that you've never made before. That's the piece that's the hardest to make. Once you've made something a few times, it allows you to kind of have the foresight of how to do each step in the process, and you know when each step has to happen. Yeah. How heavy is that now? We might be upwards of maybe 30, 35 pounds. Yeah. Yeah, it looks pretty heavy. You can see the way that George is turning and lifting the glass and the way that they have to actually shape the glass. They're using much more force and pressure to shape the material. I will say that there are definitely different things that are very challenging about making glass. Things that are very, very small, very ornate, and lots of different components added together, they tend to be very challenging. But then things on the other side of the spectrum, things that are very large, they also tend to be very challenging. And you don't have to be a really big, strong person to know how to work really large glass. It's more about knowing how to use your body to work with the material. Now, George has been working really big glass for a very long time. He's really good at it too. But I always love watching just the way that he uses his body to his advantage. The closer you can hold the glass to yourself, the better off you are, ergonomically speaking. We have a tool, we call it a yoke, but it's on a set of tracks that we put the pipe on as we roll it up to our reheating furnace. That yoke, it slides or it rolls all the way back to the furnace. So really the only time that George is having to hold and support all of that glass, it's just going from a few feet from the rails of the bench over to the yoke.
Is the flame from the torches turning red when it hits the glass because it's burning the silica?
So is the flame touching the glass as we use the torches turning red from the silica?
Yeah.
I believe they call that a sodium flare. So it's actually from the soda ash that's in the glass. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, are you worried that that tiny little piece of glass that's holding this giant, massive material to the iron is going to break? Glass is really strong during the right conditions. So a few things that make that little connection strong is, first off, the temperature, and next, the shape. As long as we keep it warm, as long as we keep it, let's say, above 1100 degrees, it's going to be pretty strong and resilient. And then also the shape. That little bit of it's a constriction, it's a really smooth kind of curve to it. If it had a very abrupt line, like a visual line that you could see kind of cut into the glass, that's a very weak area in the material. So I'd say as long as that little connection isn't any smaller than, let's say, the diameter of the iron, we really don't have to worry. I'd worry about maybe the iron breaking first. I've only seen an iron break a few times in my career. So it has happened from time to time. It's typically where the head of the iron, the thick stock that's about 6 inches long, is connected or welded to the rest of the tube. So sometimes that weld will fail. Yeah. What's that? Where did George spend like learning how to blow glass? Where did he learn? So George is a local to this area. He grew up maybe within a half-hour radius of this area. And George, he learned how to blow glass working for an independent artist that also lives in this area. So, funny thing George told me when he first started working with glass, somebody asked if he wanted a job working glass, and he said yes, and he thought he was going to work at like an automotive shop that changed glass out of cars, so changing car windows and things like that. So he didn't have any idea of what he was getting into, but he said after doing it for just a little while, he fell in love with it. And George did not go to college for it. He's a factory or production glass artist, so he's learned from working with many different people. I think he's been blowing glass for about 27 years now, and George has been working here at the museum, I think for probably about almost 20 years. Yeah. Well, I see that it looks like Josh is getting ready to put the suit on. We've got a special suit that we'll wear because we are going to have to grab a hold of this piece and put it inside an oven. So I'm going to jump on stage and just help out for a second here. Yep. You want it just to go from the bench to the yoke?
Yeah.
Yep.
Just by hand, they can real slippery.
George asked me to help out kind of lifting this iron over to the yoke here. He's been sweating for the last hour, and he says his hands are getting so slippery it's hard to turn the iron.
Take a couple flashes, even out the bottom, fluffy, and we'll be ready to roll.
All right.
The other side of the layout? Yeah. Put it out. Yeah.
So at this point, we really can't just set this piece inside an oven. We can't take it off from the iron quite yet because we need to equalize the temperature throughout the glass. If we're to break this piece off too quickly, there's a good chance this piece would just slump inside our annealing oven. Ready? So here's one process of kind of temperature equalization. We're keeping the back half warm. Using a little bit of compressed air, we're able to start to cool the top down. And we might have to do this a time or two more before the glass is actually solid. I'll make sure I grab one of the doors. So we got some protective gear here. I'm going to help you out there. Awesome. So earlier I said we've got this connection. It's very small and it could break, but it's a strong shape and it's the right temperature. So we're going to have to stress that connection to make it a bit weaker. One of the ways that we can do that is just by using water. Dripping water on that small little area it's going to rapidly cool the glass. That's going to make it weak. And it should just take a little vibration. A tap sent down the iron will break it at the weakest area. So the whole idea is to make sure that the rest of the glass is warm enough and stable enough that we are essentially creating the weakest area right at that small connection to the pipe. Good. All right, a light tap. Watch this. Breaks right off. Into our annealer. All right, let's give it up for our guest artist. That's Rob Stern. Nice job. All right, it takes a whole team to make this happen. Let's keep it going for the rest of our team here.